Once upon a time, in the land of Israel, where the sun burned hot against the golden hills and the wind carried the scent of myrrh and cedar, a man walked alone. His name was Nathan, and today his steps were heavy with a message that could change a kingdom. He had seen men fall in battle. He had seen kings rise and crumble like sand in the wind. But what he was about to do now, confronting a king not with a sword but with truth, was perhaps the most dangerous task of all. The palace loomed in the distance, its walls gleaming like fire in the afternoon sun. Inside, servants carried jars of wine and plates of roasted lamb through shaded courtyards. Musicians plucked at lyres, their melodies drifting through the air like smoke. And at the center of it all, beneath a canopy of fine linen, sat David, the warrior king. His hands rested on the arms of his chair, his gaze distant, thoughtful. Nathan had known him for years, had seen him wield a sword, had heard him sing psalms to the Lord, had watched him grow from a shepherd into a ruler. But even great men needed to be reminded of who they served. David looked up as Nathan approached, a small smile forming. "My friend, you bring news?" Nathan inclined his head. "A question, my king." David arched an eyebrow. "Go on." Nathan turned, gesturing to the palace around them. "You live in a house of cedar, built strong and tall, but where does the Ark of the Covenant rest?" David's smile faded. Nathan already knew the answer. The Ark, the very presence of God among his people, was still in a tent. David leaned forward, his eyes burning with resolve. "This troubles me, Nathan. It is not right. The Lord should have a house greater than mine." Nathan nodded. "Then you will build it?" David lifted his chin. "Yes, it will be my final work, my greatest gift to the Lord." Nathan almost agreed. It seemed right. It seemed just. But then something shifted in the air. A stillness, a weight that pressed into Nathan's chest, and suddenly he knew this was not God's will. The words rose in him like fire, and when he spoke, his voice was no longer his own. "No, my king." David's expression darkened. "No?" Nathan's heart pounded, but he did not waver. "The Lord has spoken. You are a warrior, David. Your hands have shed much blood. The house of the Lord will not be built by war." David's fingers curled around the edge of his chair. His knuckles were white. Nathan knew that few men dared to tell a king no. But Nathan was no ordinary man. He was a prophet of the living God. He stepped forward, his voice steady. "The Lord has chosen another, your son. He will build the temple, and the Lord will establish his throne forever." A long silence stretched between them. The sound of laughter and music outside the canopy felt distant, meaningless. David's breath came slow. His shoulders, once tense, relaxed. Then he laughed, not out of amusement, but in acceptance. He shook his head, rubbing a hand over his beard. "I have fought so many battles, Nathan, but this is not my fight, is it?" Nathan smiled softly. "No, my king." David sighed, tilting his face toward the sky. The afternoon light shimmered over his golden crown, and for the first time in a long while, he looked at peace. Finally, he nodded. "Then I will prepare the way. My son will build the house, and I will gather everything he needs." Nathan exhaled. David was many things: a warrior, a poet, a ruler. But today, he was a servant, and that made him greater than any king. That night, Nathan stood on the rooftop of his home, looking out over the city. The streets were still alive with the sounds of traders and travelers, their voices weaving through the warm night air. The Lord's will had been made known. But deep inside, Nathan felt an unease he could not shake, because this would not be the last time he stood before David with a message. No, the next time would be much harder. Because kings, no matter how great, still fall. And when David fell, it would be Nathan's voice that called him to account. The air in Jerusalem was thick with heat, and the scent of baked bread and olive oil drifted from the market stalls. Life in the city went on as usual, people trading, children laughing, travelers passing through the gates. But inside Nathan's home, all was silent. He sat alone, staring at the ground, his hands clasped tightly. Because tonight, he had seen something that changed everything, something he wished wasn't true. King David, the man after God's own heart, the warrior, the poet, the chosen king of Israel, had sinned. And not just any sin, a terrible one, a deadly one. It had started as a whisper, servants talking in hushed voices, a name mentioned too often in the corridors of the palace. Nathan had ignored it at first. Kings had enemies. People lied. But then he had heard the truth. David had taken Bathsheba, the wife of another man, Uriah, the Hittite. And now Uriah was dead. Not by accident, not in the chaos of battle, by David's own order. Nathan's stomach twisted. He pressed a fist against his forehead. How had it come to this? The same man who wrote songs to the Lord, the man who had spared Saul's life when he could have killed him, the man who had danced before the Ark of the Covenant in joy, had now taken another man's wife and another man's life. Nathan's pulse pounded in his ears. What would he do? What could he do? The answer came swiftly. He already knew. The next day, Nathan walked through the gates of the palace. The guards let him pass without a word. He was no stranger here, but this time his steps felt heavier. David's voice echoed from within the throne room, speaking to his advisors. He sounded normal, as if nothing had happened. Nathan clenched his jaw. Did David think God had not seen? The prophet stepped inside. David sat upon his throne, dressed in royal robes, his golden crown catching the sunlight. He turned at the sight of Nathan and smiled. "Nathan, my friend!" He spread his arms. "What brings you today?" Nathan swallowed hard. His heart was racing, but his voice remained steady. "I have a story to tell you, my king." David leaned forward, intrigued. "A story? Then speak." Nathan took a slow breath. There were two men in a city. One was rich, the other poor. David listened, nodding along. The rich man had many sheep and cattle, more than he could ever count. David smirked. "Fortunate man." Nathan did not smile. But the poor man, he had only one little lamb. He had raised it himself. It ate from his table, drank from his cup. It was like a daughter to him. David's expression softened. "A good man." Nathan's voice hardened. One day, a traveler came to visit the rich man. But instead of taking a sheep from his own flock, the rich man took the poor man's lamb and slaughtered it for his guest. David sat up straighter, his brows furrowing. Nathan continued, his voice cold. The poor man had nothing. The rich man had everything. But still, he took what was not his. David's fists clenched. His face darkened with fury. That man deserves to die. The room fell silent. Nathan's pulse pounded. Now Now was the moment. He took a slow step forward, locked eyes with David, and spoke the words that would shake the throne of Israel. "You are that man." David's entire body went still. The air in the throne room felt heavy, suffocating. The advisors standing nearby froze, their eyes darting between the prophet and the king. David's chest rose and fell sharply, but he said nothing. Nathan stepped closer. "You had everything, David: power, wealth, wives. But you saw Uriah's wife and took her as your own. And when that was not enough, you had Uriah killed with the sword of the Ammonites." David's hands shook where they rested on the arms of his throne. Nathan's voice was low, filled with sorrow. "You thought you could hide it, but the Lord has seen." David closed his eyes. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He did not try to explain, because what could he say? The Lord had seen. And now the price had to be paid. Nathan's voice was like thunder. "Because you have done this, the sword will never depart from your house. Your family will rise up against you. What you did in secret, your own sons will do before all of Israel." David shuddered. Nathan did not stop. "And the child that Bathsheba bears, he will not live." David let out a breath like he had been struck. His face twisted in pain, and at last, he broke. He fell from the throne, landing hard on his knees. His voice, once so strong, now shook with grief. "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan studied him. He had seen kings harden their hearts. He had seen men reject the word of God. But David wept. And at that moment, Nathan knew David's punishment would come. But he would not be like Saul. He would not be abandoned. The Lord would still be with him. But the days ahead would be filled with pain, division, and loss. And there was nothing Nathan or David could do to stop it. That night, Nathan walked alone through the streets of Jerusalem. David was still in his palace, still on the throne. But nothing would ever be the same again. Because sin, even for a king, always has a cost. And the price was just beginning to be paid. The city of Jerusalem seemed the same. Merchants called out in the streets. Children laughed as they ran between the market stalls, and the scent of fresh bread filled the air. But inside the palace, nothing was the same. Nathan stood in the great hall watching King David kneel in silence. For 7 days, David had neither eaten nor spoken. For 7 days, he had laid on the cold floor of his chamber, refusing the comfort of his servants, refusing food or rest. For 7 days, he had wept before the Lord. Because Bathsheba's child, the child conceived in sin, was dying. Nathan had delivered the message, but the weight of it still sat heavy on his chest. David's grief was unlike anything he had ever seen. Gone was the warrior, the king, the ruler of Israel. This was just a broken man begging for mercy. Nathan closed his eyes. He knew God's judgment was final. Yet still, David prayed. Still, he hoped. Still, he believed. But on the 7th day, the palace grew quiet. The child was dead. Nathan stood in the shadows as the servants whispered among themselves. Who will tell him? He has not eaten for days. What if he does something reckless? He will be devastated. They hesitated, afraid to speak the words aloud, but David, as if sensing their fear, lifted his head. His voice was hoarse, but steady. Is the child dead? The servants exchanged glances. Finally, one stepped forward, bowing his head. Yes, my lord. Nathan watched as David exhaled slowly, his face unreadable. Then, to everyone's shock, he rose to his feet. Without a word, he walked toward the chamber's exit. The servants exchanged confused looks. One of them whispered, "Where is he going?" Nathan already knew. David was going to worship, even in his loss, even in his sorrow. Even after his child had been taken from him, Nathan followed at a distance as David entered the house of the Lord. David knelt, bowed his head to the ground, and prayed. Not for the child, it was too late for that, but for his own heart, for forgiveness, for the strength to go on. Nathan felt his chest tighten. This was why David was different from Saul. This was why the Lord had not abandoned him. David did not rage against God. He did not blame him. He accepted the judgment, and in his brokenness, he still worshiped. Later that night, Nathan found David sitting in his chamber, eating his first meal in a week. Bathsheba sat beside him, her face pale from mourning, her hands trembling as she poured a cup of water. Nathan stepped forward. David looked up at him, his eyes worn and tired, but his voice was calm. "The Lord has taken much from me, Nathan." Nathan nodded. "And yet, you still praise him." David smiled faintly. "What else can I do? I cannot bring the child back. One day I will go to him, but he will not return to me." Nathan felt his heart ache. David had lost his son, but his punishment was not over, because God had said, "The sword will never depart from your house." And soon, that prophecy would come true. Because David's own family was about to turn against him, and the chaos was only beginning. Nathan stood in the palace courtyard, listening to the murmurs that spread like wildfire through Jerusalem. Something was brewing, something dark. The judgment of the Lord had been declared. The sword will never depart from your house. And now, David's own sons were tearing each other apart. Nathan had watched it unfold piece by piece. First came Amnon, David's firstborn son, the heir to the throne. He had taken what was not his own half-sister, Tamar. And when she had cried for justice, David had done nothing. Nathan had seen the rage building in Absalom, Tamar's full brother. He had seen the fire in the young prince's eyes, the fury in his silence. And 2 years later, Absalom struck. Amnon was dead, murdered at a feast, cut down by Absalom's own men. The royal family fell into chaos. And Nathan? He could do nothing but watch the prophecy unfold. Now, Absalom was in exile. The people whispered. Some said he was right to avenge his sister. Others said he was a traitor. But one thing was certain. Absalom would not remain in exile forever. And when he returned, he would not come as a son. He would come as a king. Nathan stood in the great hall of the palace, watching as David paced the floor. The once mighty warrior now moved like a man carrying a heavy weight. David ran a hand through his graying hair. "Joab says, I should bring Absalom back." Nathan folded his arms. "And will you?" David sighed. "He is my son." Nathan's jaw clenched. "And Amnon was your son too." David flinched. Nathan softened his voice. "You have done nothing to bring peace to your house, my king. You did not punish Amnon, and now Absalom believes he must take justice into his own hands." David looked away. Nathan knew that look. It was the same look David had worn when he had fallen into sin with Bathsheba. Shame, regret. but no action. Nathan stepped forward. "If you bring Absalom back, do not bring him in halfway. He will either be your son again, or he will be your enemy. You must choose." David nodded slowly. "I will send for him." But Nathan knew. It was already too late. Absalom returned to Jerusalem, but David refused to see him. For 2 years, the young prince walked the streets, growing more bitter, more resentful. Nathan watched as the people began to whisper, "Absalom is handsome. Absalom listens to the people. Absalom should be king." And when Absalom finally demanded to see his father, the moment was cold, distant. There was no forgiveness. There was no reconciliation. There was only a king who was tired and a son who wanted more. Nathan saw it in Absalom's eyes. This was not the return of a lost son. This was the beginning of a rebellion. The day Absalom declared himself king, Nathan was not surprised. The young prince stood at the gates of Jerusalem, calling the people to him. "My father has ruled with a weak hand, but I will bring justice. I will bring power back to Israel." And the people believed him. David fled. The mighty king, the conqueror of nations, fled his own city in shame. Nathan walked the empty halls of the palace that night, feeling the weight of the prophecy once again. "The sword will never depart from your house." David had lost his kingdom, and soon he might lose his son as well. The throne room of Jerusalem stood empty. The tapestries, once bright with the golden lion of Judah, hung motionless in the silence. The city had not fallen to an enemy army. It had fallen to David's own son. Nathan walked through the empty palace halls, his sandals echoing against the stone. Everything had changed. David was gone, fled into the wilderness with his most loyal men, and in his place, Absalom ruled. Nathan felt the weight of it all pressing down on his shoulders. The sword will never depart from your house. That prophecy had already taken Amnon, and now it had torn David and Absalom apart. But the Lord was not finished yet. There was still one final battle to come. Nathan sat in the home of Zadok the priest, the only other man in Jerusalem who knew the truth. Absalom's reign would not last. Nathan leaned forward, his voice low. "David will return." Zadok nodded. "But when?" Nathan exhaled. "When the Lord allows it." Zadok studied him carefully. "And Absalom?" Nathan closed his eyes. He already knew how this would end. David and Absalom would not rule side by side. One of them would fall, and the kingdom would bleed because of it. In the wilderness, David stood with his men. Nathan wasn't there, but he knew what the king must have been feeling: the heartbreak, the shame, the regret. David had conquered giants, nations, enemies, but now he had been driven from his own throne by his own son. He must have prayed, "Lord, I have sinned, but is this the cost? Was this the price of Bathsheba, of Uriah? Was this the sword that would never leave his house? But David was still the Lord's anointed, and Absalom? Absalom was only a king in name. He had taken his father's throne, but the throne had not been given to him by God. And soon he would pay for it. The war came quickly. Nathan heard the reports. David's forces had gathered, and the king was marching back toward Jerusalem. But David did not want Absalom to die. He had given his commanders strict orders. Deal gently with the young man Absalom. Nathan shook his head when he heard those words. Did David still not understand? Absalom would not deal gently with him. The boy had declared war, and war had no mercy. The battle raged in the forest of Ephraim. David's men were stronger, more experienced, and soon Absalom's army began to fall. The young prince fled, his horse crashing through the trees. But then his long hair caught in the branches of an oak. His horse tore forward, leaving Absalom dangling helplessly, his feet kicking in the air. He was trapped, vulnerable, defeated, but alive. David's men found him, and despite the king's orders, Joab did not hesitate. The general drove his spear into Absalom's heart, and just like that, the rebellion was over. The news reached Jerusalem first. Nathan stood in the temple courtyard when he heard the whispers, "Absalom is dead." Some of the priests sighed in relief. Nathan did not, because he knew David's heart would be shattered. Absalom may have been a traitor, a thief, a murderer, but to David, he was still his son. When the messenger arrived at David's camp, the king ran forward to meet him. "Tell me, is Absalom safe?" The messenger hesitated. David's hands clenched. "Tell me the truth." Finally, the man whispered, "May all the king's enemies be as that young man is." David froze. His breath hitched. And then he wept. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would that I had died instead of you, my son." His cries echoed through the valley. This was the price. This was the sword that would never leave his house. Nathan, miles away in Jerusalem, felt a deep sorrow settle in his chest. David had won the war, but at what cost? That night, Nathan prayed alone. "Lord, was this your will?" The Lord had given David a throne, a kingdom, a family. And in his sin, he had nearly lost it all. But still, God had not forsaken him. Nathan knew what was coming. David would return to Jerusalem. He would rule again. And from his line one day, a greater king would come. A king who would bring peace instead of war. A king who would reign forever. But until that day, the kingdom would rise and fall. And Nathan would still be here, watching, waiting, and speaking the truth no matter the cost. Jerusalem's streets, once filled with whispers of rebellion, now buzzed with anticipation. David was coming back. The king who had fled in shame was returning in victory. Nathan stood in the royal courtyard watching as servants rushed to prepare the palace, dusting the golden throne, laying out fresh linens, and lighting fragrant oils. They wanted the city to look unchanged, as if Absalom had never been here. But Nathan knew the truth. Nothing would ever be the same again. David entered Jerusalem through the eastern gate, his face weary, his robe dirtied from the wilderness. He was a king restored, but not a man restored. Nathan studied him carefully as the people cheered his return. "Long live the king! David has triumphed!" The voices rose in a mighty roar, but David? He didn't smile. His steps were slow, his face unreadable. The people rejoiced. But the father in him was still grieving. Nathan exhaled. This was the cost of sin. David had won, but it had come with blood, betrayal, and loss. That evening, Nathan entered the king's chamber. David sat alone by the window, staring into the darkened streets. He did not turn when Nathan approached. "Absalom should have lived," David said quietly. Nathan swallowed. He raised his hand against the throne. David let out a slow, bitter laugh. "So did I once, against Saul, yet the Lord spared me." Nathan studied him. "You were chosen by God." David turned, his eyes heavy with sorrow. "And Absalom was my son." Nathan sighed. "You warned him. You showed him mercy. He refused it." David's hands tightened into fists. "Did I? Or did I drive him to it?" Silence. Nathan had no answer. Because perhaps David was right. Perhaps his own failure to discipline his children, to bring justice in his own household, had led Absalom down this path. The sins of the father. They never stayed buried. Nathan stepped forward. "The Lord has restored you. You are still his chosen king." David exhaled. "And yet, my house is broken." Nathan nodded. "But not destroyed." David turned toward him, searching his face. "How can I fix this, Nathan? How do I make it right?" Nathan's voice was firm, unwavering. "Walk in obedience, my king. Teach your son to do the same." David stilled. A son. He had many, but only one would take the throne after him, and he already knew who that would be. The next day, David called for Bathsheba. Nathan stood in the chamber as she entered, her movements graceful but guarded. David gestured for her to sit beside him. "A day is coming when I will no longer sit on this throne." Bathsheba's hands trembled slightly. She had already lost one son. Would she lose another? David's gaze hardened with determination. "Solomon will be king after me." Nathan nodded in approval. Bathsheba let out a quiet breath, but her face remained unreadable. Solomon. The boy who had been born after the first child was lost. The boy who had been raised in the shadow of David's greatest sins, he would be the future of Israel. Nathan stepped forward. The Lord has chosen him. He must be taught to rule with wisdom. David's lips pressed into a firm line. "Then I will prepare him." He turned to Bathsheba. "And when I am gone, you must ensure he sits on this throne." Bathsheba nodded. "I will." Nathan knew she meant it, because Solomon would not take the throne without a fight. There would be another struggle, another rival, another battle for power. But when that day came, Nathan would be ready. That night, as Nathan walked through the palace halls, he murmured a quiet prayer. "Lord, guide the future king. Let him not fall as his father did." Because this kingdom, it was built on men's choices. And the choices of men, even kings, were fragile things. The years passed like shifting sand. David's reign was coming to an end. Nathan could see it in the way the king walked, his once mighty frame growing weaker, his once sharp eyes now clouded with age. The warrior who had defeated giants, conquered nations, and sung psalms to the Lord. Now, he spent his days resting on his bed, his breath slow and heavy. But the kingdom was not yet secure, because another son had risen to take the throne, and it was not Solomon. Nathan entered Bathsheba's chamber, his face grave. She turned sharply. "What is it?" Nathan's voice was urgent. "Adonijah has declared himself king." Bathsheba's breath caught. "No." Nathan nodded. "Even now, he feasts with Joab and Abiathar. They have anointed him." Bathsheba trembled with anger. David promised the throne to Solomon. Nathan stepped forward. "If we do not act now, Solomon will lose everything. And once Adonijah secures his place, he will not let Solomon live." Bathsheba clenched her fists. "What must we do?" Nathan's voice was steady, unwavering. "We remind the king of his promise." Moments later, Bathsheba entered David's chamber, her face pale but determined. She bowed low, then spoke in a trembling voice. "My lord, have you not sworn that Solomon would reign after you?" David's eyes flickered as he looked at her. Nathan stepped forward. "My king, Adonijah has already declared himself king. Even now, he feasts with his men." David's face darkened. He had lost Absalom to rebellion. He would not lose the throne again. With great effort, he pushed himself upright. "Call Zadok the priest. Call Benaiah. Call Solomon." His voice, though weak, was fierce with authority. "Today, my son Solomon shall sit on my throne." Solomon was anointed at Gihon, just as David had commanded. Trumpets sounded through the streets. The people shouted his name. And by the time Adonijah heard the news, it was too late. His feast of victory turned into a feast of fear. His followers fled, and he ran to the altar, clinging to it, begging for mercy. Solomon, though young, showed wisdom. If he proves himself loyal, he will live. But if wickedness is found in him, he will die. Nathan watched as the kingdom shifted hands. David's time was ending. Solomon's time was just beginning. That night, Nathan sat beside David one last time. The king's breath was slow, his body frail, but his eyes were peaceful. Nathan whispered, "It is done. Your son sits on the throne." David smiled faintly. "The Lord is faithful." His hand trembled as he reached for Nathan's. "Tell Solomon to follow him, to keep his ways." Nathan swallowed. "I will." David sighed, his eyes drifting closed. And as the dawn broke over Jerusalem, the great king breathed his last. Nathan stood at the edge of the city watching the sunrise. He had seen the rise of a shepherd boy. He had seen the fall of a king in his sin. He had seen justice, redemption, and war, and now he would see a new king rule. But the Lord had whispered one last truth to him. Solomon, wise as he would not be enough. One day, from David's line, a greater king would come, a king whose kingdom would never fall, a king who would bring true peace. And so, Nathan waited for the greatest king of all. For the greatest king of all.